Welcome to U.S. History. Uh, we're going to be looking at Chapter 29, looking at the 1960s, looking at the presidency of Kennedy and Johnson, uh, looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, a big event during the Kennedy administration, and the Vietnam War during President Johnson's administration. Kennedy came from a Catholic background. His Joseph Kennedy had been an ambassador to England during World War II, or prior to World War II. Very wealthy family. Kennedy is a very young man in terms of, in fact, he'll be the youngest president ever elected to that point. Many thought that he couldn't be elected because of his Catholic background, but he will become the first Catholic president of the United States. He's nominated by the Democratic Party. Acceptance speech spoke of a new frontier, that is, Americans achieving their full potential. The 1960 election, he will run against Nixon, and he will do much better on the TV debates than Nixon did. Many people who listened to the presidential debates felt that Nixon had won the debates, but Kennedy is a handsome man. He has sex appeal. People like the way he goes about doing things, and he's going to attract a lot of women voters as well as men voters. And the Democratic Party is going to prevail in the 1960 election. Kennedy earned support from the African American community. He arranged to have Martin Luther King released from jail. This is although he doesn't do much in terms of passing legislation for African Americans, he is somewhat sympathetic towards their plight. On the television debates, there was a series of these debates. Kennedy wins the election by a narrow vote. Some believe that there was fraud involved in the election, particularly in Chicago, which was a swing state. But Nixon never contests the revolution or the election. Nixon was the former VP of Eisenhower. He was sent throughout the world as a troubleshooter for Eisenhower. He held the kitchen debates with Khrushchev when Khrushchev came to the United States to see how we were doing things. Nixon did not have the same sex appeal that the voters had for Kennedy. If you look here, apparently Kennedy looked more presidential. And this is the first time that television has been used as a tool for electing the president. Certainly, it was a very close vote. The popular vote was virtually a dead heat, but Kennedy is going to win more electoral votes than Nixon. This shows the election in 1960. Kennedy being elected by the red states and Nixon by the blue states. There was a Senator Byrd who ran, and he received some electoral votes in the Deep South. As far as Kennedy's domestic policy, he didn't get much done while he was president. Of course, he was only a little over 2 years before he was assassinated. He believed in cutting taxes to encourage the economy, but wasn't able to secure many of those through Congress. Minimal federal aid for education, limited urban renewal, some of the things that he pushed for. Congress blocked the medical aid to elderly while he was president, although he pushed for that. Some of his victories as president, he did raise the minimum wage, and the Housing Act was passed in 1961, which gave $5 billion over 4 years to preserve open space in urban areas and develop mass transit, and the construction of the middle class housing. So this was somewhat of a victory. Uh, he did increase the spending so that we would beat the Russians to the moon, and we eventually will achieve that after his demise. Area Redevelopment Act, 1961. Distressed areas were given money to rehabilitate, renovate the buildings and homes to bring up the community. In terms of civil rights, not too much. Tried to avoid the topic because the Democrat was voters in the South were part of his base, which typically is what politicians try to do. They try to straddle the fence. Eventually, by circumstances, he's going to be pushed more and more to defending the rights of African Americans. So most of the things that he did was pretty much symbolic in terms of helping African Americans receive racial equality and the vote. We remember that the 24th Amendment is going to be passed and it's going to eliminate poll taxes, but this is not going to be during his presidency. Literacy tests, white primaries, intimidation, all these things that kept people from voting, he's not going to have too much of an effect on that. Kennedy was determined that the United States would be the first one on the moon to show that our system worked better than the Soviet system. Because he was a fence straddler in some ways, he didn't satisfy either side. But the civil rights movement, militants, as well as Martin Luther King, are going to force his hand. The Freedom Riders we talked about on the civil rights. This is in 1961, showing that there was discrimination on interstate bus transportation. When Kennedy witnesses this violence being perpetrated on the Freedom Riders, he will ask the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue a ruling segregating all interstate facilities, and this will happen. The Interstate Commerce agree, and the Corps is victorious. This is Congress on Racial Equality. These show a couple of Freedom Riders beaten up in Montgomery, Alabama, because they were trying to force racial integration of the bus system. During his presidency, James Meredith of the University of Mississippi is going to be successfully enrolled and graduate. And JFK is going to send the U.S. Army to enforce a court order to help him enroll there. Showdown at Birmingham, Alabama. Cities close parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, golf courses to avoid desegregation. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and jailed. This is one of the famous quotes that he delivers while he's in jail. He says, "We know that through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressors. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Justice too long delayed is justice denied." So he doesn't abandon his nonviolent approach, but he certainly believes that things have to change in America. This shows James Meredith, who breaks the color barrier at the University of Mississippi. Bull Connors, maybe someone you'll need to know for the AP exam. He was a police commissioner at Birmingham, Alabama, who used dogs and cattle prods to perpetrate violence on the peaceful protesters. King's hotel is bombed while he's there in Alabama, and JFK will side with Martin Luther King. From that point on, Kennedy will push actively for civil rights. Probably would have gotten it through Congress had he lived. He will federalize the Alabama National Guard to enforce desegregation at the University of Alabama. George Wallace, governor, stands at the way of the door and prevents black students from entering. And he says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation for the future. Interesting to note that he will run for president later on, and an assassin will try to kill him, but he's paralyzed from the waist down. This is a picture of Bull Connor confronting peaceful protesters. This is Alabama Governor George Wallace standing and preventing blacks from attending the public university. Medgar Evers is a martyr for the NAACP. He'll be killed in his front yard. This is many saw this as a retaliation for Meredith being admitted into college. In response to all this, JFK Kennedy will announce that he will push through a civil rights bill which will crush segregation, outlaw discrimination, and enforce school integration. So the March 1963, led from Martin Luther King, protesters demanded Kennedy push for the civil rights. This is again, I Have a Dream speech. This shows Medgar Evers. He was shot down in his front yard by Klan members, and he was an active member of the NAACP in Mississippi. This shows Martin Luther King delivering his famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial to hundreds of thousands of people, saying that racial integration needs to happen now. In terms of the Cold War, Kennedy came up with what he called a flexible response, and that is that he would support the buildup of conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons. Of course, during the election, he had criticized Eisenhower for allowing a missile gap to exist between the United States and the Soviet Union, but in fact, no gap really existed. But he will produce or push for conventional weapons because not all conflicts can be decided by nuclear missiles. Kennedy replaced Eisenhower's heavy reliance on nuclear weapons with conventional weapons. He will also help create the Green Beret, an elite commando force to fight communists in third world countries. ICBMs, these are intercontinental ballistic missiles, will be increased under his watch, as well as more tanks and airplanes and ships and so forth. The Bay of Pigs, this is in 1961. This had been started by the CIA. They were planning to take Cuban exiles and invade Cuba to overthrow Castro. Invaders will supposed to trigger a popular uprising in Cuba, but that never happened. The plan was a complete failure. JFK will take responsibility, but he will blame privately the CIA for getting us involved in that. He also institutes a Peace Corps, which is going to send young men and women to third world countries to help them improve their conditions by helping them educate the people in terms of farming and technology and education, and the program was quite successful. This is a picture of the Bay of Pigs, and we'll stop right there. And the communists that controlled